This week in Texas, we explore several bills on the legislative agenda in Austin as the 2023 regular session draws closer to an end. And the specter of a special session this summer looms large.
It's a real power that the governor has.
We explore religiously themed bills in the House and Senate and the separation of church and state.
The phrase does not appear in the Constitution. Rather, it was taken from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote as president to a group of Baptists. And the meaning of that phrase is widely contested.
Also, Melanie Lawson talks with Harris County's attorney about legislation which would strip local control and give it to the state.
This is all about politicians and it's not about elections.
We also take to the border as Title 42 ends and a new era of immigration begins. Our Daniela Hurtado reports from El Paso.
What we're seeing here at the border is a national issue.
And we take a look at Houston's place on the global economic stage with a new report from the Greater Houston Partnership.
We are the gateway for the rest, for many other parts of the U.S. shipping stuff overseas.
From Austin to El Paso and back to Houston, we cast a wide net across the issues that matter this week in Texas. And hello again. Thanks for being with us. I'm Tom Abrams. We start today with the possibility of a special legislative session this summer after Governor Greg Abbott suggested he would call one if school choice or voucher legislation does not arrive on his desk to sign by the end of the regular session. And that, we know, is not the only issue which could force lawmakers into overtime yet again. The fight over school vouchers or school choice could lead to a special session at the Capitol this summer. The Senate and House versions of the bill that would provide public money for students to attend private schools are vastly different. Different enough that Governor Greg Abbott threatened extra time in Austin for state legislators if the House cannot agree to something akin to what the Senate already passed. It may not work.
When they're threatened like this, the House doesn't respond to that threat. The House basically ends up going in a different direction.
State Senator Brandon Creighton is the author of the Senate bill. He remains hopeful the House will come around.
It's a process, and we don't have much time on the clock, but I think we'll either have expanded school choice in Texas here in the regular session right at the goal line, or we will find that we will be in a special session working on the same.
Mark Wiggins with the Association of Texas Professional Educators thinks the governor's focus is on the wrong part of education.
I think it's telling what the governor is not threatening a special session over. He's not threatening a special session to make sure that we fully fund school safety or special education or give teachers a raise to make sure our classrooms aren't empty when we start school next fall.
A special session is common in Texas. Governor Abbott called 3 2 years ago, the first of which led Democrats to leave the state for Washington, D.C. over a voter integrity bill. He also called one in 2017. Governor Rick Perry called 12 special sessions, and Richards 4. George W. Bush is the only Texas governor in the last 30 years to not call a special session.
It's a real power that the governor has. That is, the legislature can decide it's not going to pass something the governor wants passed, but the governor can call the legislature back into special session every 30 days up until January of 2025 if he doesn't get what he wants.
Also at play, property tax relief. The Senate wants to offer larger homestead exemptions. The House would cut the maximum increase in half. Like vouchers, property tax relief is among the governor's top priorities, and it, too, could lead to a summer of work under the dome. Among the bills that have Governor Abbott's support is Senate Bill 1515. It would mandate copies of the 10 Commandments inside Texas classrooms. It has already passed the Senate and is awaiting a vote on the floor of the House. For perspective and how the legislation squares with the First Amendment, we turn to constitutional law expert Josh Blackman.
If you had asked me that question about 5 or 10 years ago, I'd say the answer is no. But in light of some recent Supreme Court decisions, the answer is maybe. The Supreme Court has been trending more towards allowing more religion in places like schools and other public squares.
And this really started in the 1950s, right, with the In God We Trust, among other things, as a response to communism. Is that historically accurate? When we first started seeing that?
Well, I think there are a couple things that happened in the 1940s and 50s. One was putting the motto "In God We Trust." Also, the Pledge of Allegiance was modified to say "One nation under God." There were certain changes made to bring religion more into the square. But I think the Ten Commandments in particular is a very long heritage. If you go to most courthouses, most government buildings, they have displays of the Ten Commandments. Indeed, at the Texas Capitol, we had this huge granite monument to the Ten Commandments, has been there for a very long time. But I think the last 50 or 60 years or so, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't have any religion in the schools. It might coerce students. Keep it away. And that's been the trend for the last half century or so.
So this idea of separation between church and state, is that in the Constitution, or is it just something that has become lore?
The First Amendment says that the government cannot make a law respecting the establishment of religion. That's what it says. And what does it mean to establish religion? Well, one approach is you can't force people to practice one religion over the other. Okay. Another approach is you can't force people to pay for religious services. Okay. But what about having a prayer at the start of a government meeting, or having a copy of the Ten Commandments posted, or having a Christmas tree or a menorah or a creche in a government building, right? These are more difficult questions. Starting in the 1940s and 50s, the Supreme Court said that what the First Amendment means is we must have a strict separation of church and state. That phrase does not appear in the Constitution. Rather, it was taken from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote as president to a group of Baptists. And the meaning of that phrase is widely contested, but not everyone agrees with that. But at least from the 1940s throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even into the 2010s, the court sort of stuck with the idea that we need to keep this separation of church and state. And the reason why is what we call coercion. That if young children are exposed to religion, they may feel coerced or pressured to participate in that ceremony. So for example, what if a rabbi wants to give a prayer during graduation? A student may feel compelled to stand and show respect to that prayer. Or perhaps a student may say, I don't want to go to graduation. And that was considered unfair. That was the law. Different standard now. We had a case last term at the Supreme Court involving a football coach in Washington State. And the coach would say a prayer before the start of games. He didn't make his players join him. He would sort of pray quietly at the 50-yard line. But it turns out many players joined him. And some players said, well, you know, I thought if I want to get more playing time, then maybe I should join this coach. The Supreme Court said that's not enough. Right? The mere fact that students may feel pressure because of the prayer is not enough to declare it unconstitutional. So in light of this precedent from the Washington football coach, the Ten Commandments issue, I think, is live, and it may be a different way than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago.
My guess would be that should it pass, if it does, it would immediately be challenged.
Immediately.
And it would find its way ultimately to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Given the current makeup of the court, I'm assuming that's part of the reason that you're suggesting it's a fair and open question.
Right, and the law is crafted in somewhat of a very specific manner, and it doesn't require the school districts to pay for the Ten Commandment displays. It says they must accept donations, so it actually wouldn't even cost the school districts a penny. But this will be challenged immediately in Houston, and Austin, and Dallas, and all the other places in our state. And I think what the Texas legislature is hoping is that the new Supreme Court will treat this law differently. We saw this with abortion, and we've seen this with other areas where the court has sort of reversed older precedents.
Anything else you think it's worth adding in this discussion about separation between church and state and the Ten Commandments in particular?
Well, there's another bill pending in the House involving prayer. That one is actually perhaps more significant. This bill would allow school districts to approve a prayer before the day begins. Now, critically, they don't have to. So if Houston doesn't want it, they won't have it in Houston. If Dallas doesn't want it, they won't have it in Dallas. But if smaller school districts in the state choose, they can have a prayer. And it's in a very precise manner in which parents have to basically opt in to allow the students to hear the prayer. In other words, unless a student opts in, there'll be no prayer. So students who might complain about it will never be exposed to the prayer. And even since you can't broadcast the prayer on the PA system, it's got to be only for those people who opt in. So this will make it very hard to challenge in court. I see this bill as actually the trickier one because it's actually a prayer rather than just a symbol on the wall that people can ignore every day.
And would this conform or perhaps be lawful in part because on a lot of high school campuses you have FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, where they'll gather before school and pray. Mm-hmm. That's opt-in.
Right. The difference is this is actually sponsored by the school itself and not by an extracurricular organization. And I think what they're trying to do is allow smaller school districts, which maybe have a higher percentage of religious kids, to pray quietly before school starts out of the earshot of people who can object to it. Teachers who don't want to participate won't have to, so it'll be a very self-selecting group. This bill, combined with the Ten Commandments bill, would really sort of test the Supreme Court's precedents concerning religion in schools.
Now we turn to anchor Melanie Lawson and her conversation with Harris County Attorney Christian Menefee and their discussion about Senate Bill 1933, which would allow the state to call for a do-over of county elections under certain circumstances. That bill does target Harris County specifically.
This is about the bill that is being proposed by Republicans in the Senate, and it sort of targets Harris County in particular when it comes to elections and the opportunity to toss them out if they so decide. What are your feelings about that?
I think it's reprehensible. You know, there's been room for improvement in Harris County elections for a very long time. I'm sure we all remember the days of Republican Stan Stannard having issues that made national news in our elections. But it wasn't until you started to see diverse people get in charge of Harris County government that all of a sudden they want to have a criminal investigation. All of a sudden they want to try to empower someone in Austin to overturn the results of Harris County elections. So I am committed to, if this law passes, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that Harris County is in the courtroom on this, fighting to get this law overturned.
So do you feel as though it's discriminatory, that that's what this is all about?
I believe that this bill is about targeting Harris County's election. It's about going after local control and the folks who are elected to serve the people of Harris County and to make decisions surrounding those elections, and instead give that power to people in Austin, many of whom have no working knowledge of how things go in local government. People elected us in Harris County to be able to run elections. They elected us to be able to appoint someone to be in charge of that process. And I don't believe the governor, the senators, the Texas legislature, or anybody should be able to undo the will of the people in that respect. And certainly after an election, to throw out results is just a reprehensible thing. And I will do everything I can to fight that in the courtroom.
Yeah, and you said that you will sue them. So you consider this to be outside of the bounds of what Texas is supposed to be able to do?
Absolutely. You know, long ago, our founders here in the state of Texas set out the Texas Constitution, ensuring that legislators in Austin wouldn't be able to have personal vendettas against certain local governments and pass laws that were aimed just at those governments. But that's exactly what this law does. And in fact, that constitutional prohibition was designed to keep senators from using their personal vendettas against governments and to keep them from trying to trade. But instead, we've seen that Senator Middleton and some of his colleagues are trying to pass this law to target Harris County. So we're going to sue them because we believe it's unconstitutional under the Texas Constitution. And more importantly, we believe that the will of the voters of the people of Harris County who elected me to serve in this role, who elected our county commissioners court, that should be respected. And when they cast their ballot, it is a serious thing. It's one of the most important liberties we have in this country. And my office is going to do everything we can to protect that right.
Now, they're saying that all they would require is to redo the vote. Do you have objections to that? I mean, do you feel as though that would cure the problem?
I have huge objections to the redoing of an election. You know, we have people, good people, Democrats, Independents, Republicans, people of all political persuasions who volunteer their time to participate in the massive task of running an election in the third largest county in the country. To force those folks to have to come back because of your political vendettas and have to redo an election is reprehensible. But beyond that, let's talk about the single mom who has 2 kids and is working 2 jobs and has to make time to be able to go cast her ballot. You have told her that her vote does not count. You have told her that your political shenanigans in Austin are more important than her exercising her right to vote. It's wrong. It shouldn't be happening. And that's why we're going to sue to protect people from these legislators who are overstepping their boundaries.
Wouldn't it be as simple as making sure there are enough paper ballots?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
I said, wouldn't it be as simple as making sure there are enough paper ballots that there aren't any problems with the election, which is what they're maintaining?
I don't believe that this is about improving elections at all. In fact, we saw that in 2020, when even the then Secretary of State said that it was a smooth and secure election, you saw the Republican-run legislator go and pass laws to undo a lot of the work that was done in Harris County. You saw them ban drive-through voting. You saw them ban 24-hour voting. I think what we can expect is every single legislative cycle, regardless of what happens in Harris County, you're going to see legislators trying to restrict the right to vote. That's because ultimately this isn't about making elections better. It's about scoring political points on the backs of the good people who run elections and on the backs of the good people who vote in these elections. And so we're going to stand up and we're not going to allow them to make these pretextual arguments. There's always going to be room for improvement in elections, and certainly in elections with a county of this size with this many people. And we're dedicated to ensuring that we make elections better. But I don't want anybody to be under the assumption that if Harris County has a perfect election, just like it did in 2020, you wouldn't see these laws being passed to undermine Harris County government, because it's always going to come. The goal is to undermine.
And do you feel as though if they had applied this statewide, it would be a little bit better? I mean, are you concerned about the fact that they targeted Harris County?
I don't believe that a bunch of legislators in Austin should be in the business of forcing redos of elections. When people go in and cast their ballot, that is to be respected. But I believe there's a very important reason why you're not seeing this bill purport to apply to counties throughout the state. And that's because Republicans, Democrats, Independents alike throughout the state don't like it, right? There's a reason why they didn't include other counties, including Republican-run counties, because how do you think a Republican county judge in some county here in the state of Texas would feel if the legislator were passing a law telling their voters that they're going to have to get up and go back to the polls because of some political red meat that folks are using to throw to their base? So I think the reason that it doesn't apply to the entire state is that exact purpose, right? It's to target Harris County, and it's because no voters, Republican, Democrat, anybody, supports this type of measure. This is all about politicians, and it's not about elections.
Anything?
When we come back, we take you to the Texas-Mexico border and visit with the people in El Paso as the COVID-era immigration policy Title 42 came to an end. Title 42, the COVID-era immigration policy, which allowed the denial of entry for migrants, even those seeking asylum, is over. Ahead of the policy's ending, there was concern the change in policy could lead to another rush of migrants at a border already inundated with scores of men, women, and children seeking refuge here in the United States. As the policy sunset, ABC 13 reporter Daniela Hurtado went to El Paso, one of the cities most impacted by an immigration system experts agree is in need of an overhaul.
No matter how much we plan, we still won't be prepared.
Under the blazing sun in downtown El Paso, hundreds of undocumented immigrants are making the streets their temporary home. It brings us here to this tent city coined Little Venezuela, in the back alley of the Opportunity Center for the Homeless. The area has housed a peak of 800 immigrants. The shelter doesn't have sufficient space inside.
These are people, and we need to treat them as people.
John Martin is a director at the shelter and says they've seen a surge of migrants in the last 2 weeks.
And that's the difficult thing to plan for.
As Title 42 is set to end on Thursday night, many are expecting an even larger wave of crossings.
What we're seeing here at the border is a national issue, and it needs to be addressed on a national basis.
Meantime, Border Patrol agents were out by the numbers today, handing out forms and encouraging the people still undocumented to turn themselves in and get processed or face deportation as soon as tomorrow. As we were in Little Venezuela this morning, we saw many on the fence making the decision to turn themselves in for processing. Kelvin Garcia, with a map in hand, was determined to turn himself into Border Patrol. He says they were told to turn themselves in peacefully for processing, and the promise is that they weren't going to be deported. This is David Diaz from Venezuela. He tried to cross with his family through Matamoros. His wife and children were taken in for processing, but he was turned away. He says women and children were prioritized. Today, while in line at CBP, he made his second attempt to be processed in order to reunite with his family that has since made it to Alabama. For this Venezuelan mother, the promise rendered true. She was out within hours of turning herself in. She says she's very happy and thankful for the opportunity to present her case before a court. Tonight, with a piece of paper in hand, that to many out here represents hope for a better future in the land of the free and home of the brave. Daniela Hurtado, ABC 13, Eyewitness News.
Still to come on This Week in Texas, a fresh look at Houston's place in a global economy. We'll sit down with one of the authors of a new exhaustive report that outlines just how well the Bayou City fares on the world economic stage. Now to a new report from the Greater Houston Partnership, which explores Houston's place in a global economy. We sat down with economist Patrick Jankowski to highlight the report's findings. How's Houston doing?
Houston's doing well. It's one of the strengths of our economy. We're blessed that we have three things that drive our economy. One is oil and gas. The other is the national economy, but a substantial part of our economy is driven by what happens on the global stage. And right now, the global ties to Houston's economy are really strong and doing really well.
We've heard for some time that the Port of Houston is an economic engine. That seems to be reflected in your report.
Yes, the port is an economic engine. We're lucky that the port handles stuff that we make here, but it also handles stuff which gets made elsewhere in the U.S. We are the gateway for the rest, for many other parts of the U.S. shipping stuff overseas. Now we talk about the Port of Houston. There's a Port of Galveston, the Port of Freeport, a port in Texas City. There's an airport north. They all contribute to this international trade that Houston benefits from.
Our population is increasingly global.
Yes, 1.7 million Houstonians were born outside the United States. It's like 1 in 4. I'll take it even one step further. It's not just population, it's the workforce. And I looked at the data just real recently, and roughly a third of Houston's workforce was born outside the United States. So imagine Houston's economy a third smaller. I mean, we've definitely benefited from the people who've moved here from overseas.
What is the biggest takeaway from this report? Was there something that you looked at as you compiled all the data and thought, that's a surprise?
Well, maybe not a surprise, but it was nice, kind of a reaffirmation of something I suspected. The parts of our economy which are tied to global trade, that pretty much every one of them has recovered. Everyone except for international air travel, and that's going to recover this year as we start to see a little bit more flexibility with people allowed to enter the U.S. and people who, more airlines adding air service. But just pretty much across the board, every sector that's tied to global trade has recovered from COVID.
And in a lot of cases, it's higher than it was pre-COVID.
Oh gosh, yeah. We set a record for container traffic handled through the Port of Houston last year. 3.2 million loaded containers, you know, those big things that we see on the back of 18-wheelers going up and down I-10. That's almost 500,000 more than we did the year before. We handled close to 380 million metric tons of cargo through the ports in the region. That was a record. We handled almost, that's valued at $371 billion. That was a record. Just about everywhere you look across the way, we've set records last year. It's just that, once again, I keep on saying this point, it's a testimony to just how tied we are to the global economy and how well we are doing selling our stuff overseas.
So when you look at many parts of the country, you talk about inflation. We certainly have felt that here. You also hear rumblings of a recession. Is Houston even close to feeling that?
If you look, the best indicator is job growth. And if you look at job growth, we're still creating a substantial number of jobs. Last year, we created 142,000 jobs. That was the second best year on record. If you look at it on a seasonally adjusted basis so far this year, first 3 months of the year for which we have data, 34,000 jobs. I mean, we're already halfway to what a normal year would be, and the data is only there for 3 months. So I'm concerned about a slowing economy, but I'm not worried about a slowing economy.
Why are these metrics looking so good for our region?
A couple reasons. For one thing, you do have a little bit of a slingshot effect. There was so much demand that was suppressed that finally returned. Also, you know, Houston's a place people want to live. It's a place companies want to open up businesses. We've got a fairly good business climate. One way to look, there's this thing called foreign direct investment. Companies which are overseas that are looking somewhere to open up an office. And last year we had 44 foreign companies announce they're opening up some sort of office or warehouse or manufacturing plant. That's up from 33 in 2021 and only 13 in 2020. I mean, if a company is looking to enter the U.S. market, they're finding out that Houston's probably one of the easiest or best places to enter the U.S., enter through Houston rather than New York or San Francisco.
And we're one of the cities with the most number of consular offices as well.
We rank third. We're tied with Chicago. It's New York, LA, and tied with Chicago.
So what does this data tell you looking forward? Are you able to project anything based on what you're seeing?
Well, one of the things it does, it gives me a little bit more peace of mind, a little bit more relaxed. We talk about needing to diversify Houston's economy. And there are different ways you diversify it. We talked about diversifying away from energy. That's diversifying on an industrial base, but you can also look at diversifying your markets. And we're not just selling to the U.S., we're selling globally. So if the U.S. slows, we'll still be selling globally. If the global economy slows, we'll be selling to the U.S. But the global economy is still going to grow. It grew 3.2% last year. International Monetary Fund is projecting it to grow 2.8% this year. A little bit slower than last year, but it's still growth. And if the global economy is going to grow, Houston will still grow this year.
To download a copy of that full report, you can visit houston.org. Some final thoughts when we come back. That does it for another edition of This Week in Texas. Thanks to Melanie Lawson and Daniela Hurtado for their reporting, and thank you for watching. As always, you can view all of our previous episodes wherever you stream ABC 13 or on our website at abc13.com/thisweekintexas. For all of us here at ABC 13, I'm Tom Abrams. Be kind to one another.